Did anyone notice the hum? Good. Now, if you were here last week in person, you probably don't know what I'm talking about. But if you happened to be listening online last Sunday, you definitely do. Or if you're listening right now. You see, a few weeks ago, we began to upgrade our AV system. And it really looked like everything was working out great. These new projectors were beautiful. All the sound stuff was working, the new camera. It all sounded good in here. But online, a hum began to appear. Sometimes it was quieter, sometimes it was louder, but it was always there. It was so frustrating to have that on, of all days, Easter. But that stuff happens. You know, it even happens at Disney World. During Holy Week, my son and wife went to Disney for a few days. And my son tells me they had a great time. But it wasn't perfect. Because there were times that they would go for a certain ride, and they couldn't. Because the ride was broken. One time they went back hours later, and the ride was still broken. Sheesh, if it can happen in the happiest place on earth, it can happen anywhere. You know, it can even happen 1,000,000 miles up in space. Did you hear about that telescope that we sent up into space a few years ago? It sits out there 1,000,000 miles from Earth. Took us decades to figure out how to get it there. And when they sent it up, they thought they had a way worse problem than a hum. You see, because when they began to calibrate the telescope, they focused the lens on a certain star. And when they did, all these blips began to appear. Hold on. See, you can see it right there. That's the actual image that they saw. And when they saw these blips, they were like, oh my gosh, something is seriously wrong here. But here's the shocker. Nothing was wrong with the telescope at all. No, it was seeing perfectly what was there. It's just that what the telescope was seeing, no one on earth had ever seen before. See, what those little blips are, they're not stars. They're galaxies. Billions of stars, each one. And scientists had speculated that many galaxies could exist. But even when they were seeing it, they couldn't see it. In other words, the malfunction wasn't with the telescope, it was with the people looking at the telescope. But that's kind of a good thing, because it enabled them to see just how clueless they were about the universe. How much we still don't know. And how much do we not know? Charitably, we understand maybe 4% of the universe. In fact, 95% of the universe, we don't even know what it is. Scientists call it dark matter. They don't call it because it's dark. They call it that because they are in the dark about what it is. But that's good. Because if you know you're in the dark, then you can begin to see the light. And that's not simply true for astronomy, it's true for life. Do you want a life of fulfillment, of joy, And it begins in the dark. It's only the darkness that will lead you to the light. And in these words, some of Jesus' most famous, Jesus actually points the way through the darkness to that light. So let's listen and hear what it is Jesus has to say. And you can find the words behind me on the bulletin, or you can also in the screen, or find them in the bulletin. This is the beginning of what is typically known as the Sermon on the Mount. And this is that opening part that usually are called the Beatitudes. And we're just reading the first one this morning. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, do you get what Jesus is doing here in the words you just heard and the words you're going to hear over the coming weeks as we go through this entire series of Beatitudes, these blesseds? Jesus is showing you the way to a life of fulfillment and joy, to life as God intends life to be. And over the coming weeks, we're going to be exploring these, but today we're going to start with the foundation, that very first step upon which all the others kind of land. This is the foundation of it all. And so what is that first step? It is to realize how out of step you are. That only the darkness leads you to the light. Now, how does the darkness lead you to the light? Well, to understand that, you need to understand that Jesus is making a much larger point. And the point is that everyone is in the dark. Everyone is blind to reality. And this is not the state of the world around you. This is the state of the world within you. The darkness, so to speak, is within. You're blind. But more tragically than that, you are blind to your own blindness. You don't see how in the dark you are. Does anyone remember an old cartoon named Mr. Magoo? If you don't, let me give you a quick rundown. Mr. Magoo was this charming old man who was blissfully unaware that he could hardly see anything. And so in each episode, Magoo would avoid near catastrophe after near catastrophe, all created by this delusion that he could see when he could literally hardly see anything. Now, while Magoo avoided catastrophe, that wasn't so true for everyone around him. Wherever Magoo went, he left a wake of destruction behind him. Now, what makes for a marginally entertaining cartoon makes for a tragically self-defeating way of life. And yet Jesus is saying here that this is the way of life that is everyone's default. That everyone, by default, is in the dark. That they're not in touch with what's really there. And they're blind to their own blindness. And the only way to be free from this darkness, from this blindness, is to get a wake-up call. A wake-up call that shows you just how blind you are. And in these words, Jesus is giving you that wake-up call. And Jesus is doing it through a word that everyone in Jesus' day thought they understood perfectly. Now, and that word is a word that is translated here, blessed. Now, come on. Does anyone really know what blessed means? I mean, sometimes you'll hear people use it in kind of a churchy way. You'll ask them, how are you doing? And they'll go, well, I'm blessed. And you're like, okay. And you're like, well, I guess that's a good thing. Sounds a good thing, but do you really know what that even means? That's why a lot of times in certain translations, they'll translate this word happy. Happy are the poor in spirit. And that gets you closer. It's a little bit more clearer, but you're not there yet. And so to get there, you need to go to the OG, which in this case means the original Greek. And the word that is used here is a word called makarios. Now, the Greeks most often described one particular group as makarios. And that was the gods on Mount Olympus. They said, the gods in Mount Olympus are so makarios. They have divine powers, superpowers, really. They don't ever have to work. They just get to relax all day and eat grapes. It's all good. See, because Makarios described a state of incredibly good fortune, where somehow you have arrived into wealth and privilege and power, that you have won life's lottery. But here's the irony. If you took someone from first century Greece and dropped them into a typical American household now, and they saw the size of those homes, they saw all the magical machines that make our life so easy, including air conditioning, thank you, God. If they saw these magical wafers of silicon that we walk around that gives you access to all sorts of wonders, these kind of vessels of metal that fly at incredible speeds, you know what they would think? They would think, Makarios, oh my gosh, what a life of wealth and privilege. What strokes of good fortune. These people are so Makarios. Yet, let me ask you, you feeling all that Makarios today? Probably not. And if you're not feeling all that Makarios, all that fortunate, then you would be right, Jesus says. And if you are feeling Makarios, Jesus would tell you it has nothing to do with any of that anyway. That's why Jesus uses this word in such a bizarre way. He uses it not to describe the gods of Mount Olympus. He uses it to describe people who are, as he terms them, poor in spirit. Now, how would knowing that you are poor like that, poor spiritually, poor in spirit, how is that Makarios? How is that incredibly fortunate? Well, first of all, it is because Jesus is telling you the truth. That if you know that you are poor like that you are empty like that you are blind like that, then you have experienced a stroke of remarkably good fortune. You are of all people most fortunate. Imagine that you're on a journey and you're going someplace that you very much want to be. Yet no matter how far you travel, it seems that you're never really getting there. And let's say this place is called Makarios, the place where everything is good. Yet no matter how fast you go, how far you travel, you never seem to get there. So One day you're tired, exhausted, you decide to take a break for lunch. And over lunch, while there, you meet someone who tells you something shocking. They tell you you've got it all wrong, that you're not heading towards Makarios at all, that you're actually heading away from it. Yes, Makarios exists, definitely, oh sure, but it's not that way. Now, you might be a bit embarrassed that you got it wrong, but you'd also be grateful. You'd think, oh my gosh, imagine I could have spent my entire life heading in the wrong direction. You would likely consider yourself fortunate. Makarios. That you had received this bit of crucial wisdom. But the fortunateness gets more. Because you see, Jesus not only tells you here that in order that this fortune introduces you to the kingdom of heaven, yes, but in order to do that, you have to become empty. You have to acknowledge your emptiness. You have to acknowledge your blindness. You have to acknowledge that you don't know where to go. And when you do that, then you will discover at this kingdom of heaven that this fulfillment for which you're looking, it isn't out there somewhere at all. That it's always been right here before you. Right here in this moment. Because look at what Jesus says. He says, blessed, fortunate, Makarios are the poor in spirit, not because they are on their way to the kingdom of heaven. No, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is saying that kingdom is right here with you right now. And the key to receiving it, to seeing it, is to acknowledge that on your own you can't see it, that you're blind to it. To acknowledge your emptiness and your need to be filled. And only then will you have eyes to see. I mean, think about that image that we saw a few moments ago. Those scientists were looking at something wondrous. Something they had been yearning to see their entire life. And yet, they at first didn't see it at all. Only when they began to acknowledge that maybe the problem wasn't with the telescope, that the problem was with them, were they able to see. And in the same way, Jesus is saying that the first step towards fulfillment is acknowledging this blindness, this inability to see. And that when you do that, then you see how wondrous and amazing the kingdom of heaven is for you right here, right now. Now, how does that happen? How do you get there? If you're here already, how do you see that you're here? Each morning after I do my run, I take a walk through the neighborhood. And as I kind of to cool down. And as I do that, I repeat a ancient Christian prayer. And the prayer goes like this. Jesus, Lamb of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, I got to admit, when I first heard this prayer, I thought, oh, that is one downer of a prayer. Oh, woe is me. Oh, I'm so bad. But then, I read that for centuries, Christians had testified to the power of this prayer. It's called the Jesus Prayer. So I said, let me try it out. And as I meditated upon it, I discovered the source of its power. The power of the prayer is that it gets you in touch with your blindness, with your poverty, with your emptiness. And the more that I got in touch with that, the more powerful the prayer became. And all of a sudden, as I looked at my neighborhood that I look at every day, I began to see it. And I wish I could find words to describe what I see. I could give you words like luminous and glowing, but it wouldn't begin to describe it. All I can tell you is that what I see fills me with wonder, with awe. And sometimes, and we'll get to this next week, with even sadness, that I walk through life missing it so much of the time. And as I see it, I feel grateful. Grateful that God is present with me right here, right now. Now, there's a danger in what I'm telling you, because you can begin to see this prayer as a technique. Like, oh, I'll write that prayer down. And then somehow the prayer will conjure up for you the kingdom of heaven. And the danger in that is that you can begin to think it's about you. And the more that you do and you experience the kingdom of heaven, and say you do that, you pray the prayer and you're like, oh, I think I see what Kennedy's talking about. What can happen is you become full of yourself. You're like, now I've reached enlightenment. But you see, being poor in spirit is not something you get past or get over. Being poor in spirit has to become more and more the way you see yourself all the time. Not because you're feeling bad about yourself, but because you're seeing how much more there is than what you see. See, that's the danger behind any sort of religious practice, going to church, reading the Bible, obeying the rules. As good as all those things are, if they lead you to a sense of self-satisfaction or a sense of enlightenment, then you've simply become blind again. That's why Jesus often criticized religious people, because religious people, it's so hard for them to see they're blind because they are so convinced they're living in the light. That's why the key is always to have this sense in your life of your own blindness, of your own poverty, of your own emptiness. And the more that you have that, the more Jesus can fill you. The more Jesus can open you up to the reality of God's presence in your life in every moment. And then as you do so, you will experience moments that are luminous, moments that you can't even describe to someone, but you know it. And in those moments, they'll begin to bleed into other parts of your life. They'll begin to become the background noise, almost a good hum that is there with you always. And how does this happen? It happens the more and more you face your emptiness, your blindness, your need. For when you do, then Jesus will fill you. But it's important to understand that it's a gift, not something you achieve. In fact, the word that Matthew picked here, the word that Jesus used, tells you that. Because Matthew could have picked a different word. There's another word for happiness in Greek called eudaimonia. You could have said eudaimonia are the poor in spirit. And eudaimonia means happiness, but it means the happiness you achieve, the happiness you get through wise living and hard work. And as worthy as that sort of happiness is, I recommend it for everyone, it can blind you to the deeper reality, to the deeper truth, to the deeper blessing. And for that, it doesn't come through anything you do or earn. It comes through an attitude of emptiness, a stance of acknowledging your blindness. And when you do, then Jesus will come and fill you, and the light of Jesus will show you the way. And then Jesus will fill you with a love that will lead you deeper and deeper into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus will give you a joy that will ground you on your darkest of days. Jesus will fill you with a richness that will stun you at the infinite abundance of God's love for you. But the ironic thing is that you'll never reach the end of it. You'll always feel that there is more and more, that you're still empty, you're still blind, but not because you feel badly inside yourself, but because you realize you're only getting a glimpse of the beauty, the infinite beauty that's there. You're only getting a taste of the richness God has for you. Now, how does this richness come? It comes only when you face your emptiness, when you acknowledge your blindness. For then you see, and then the fullness comes.